Chapter 6. After dinner, we moved to the living room where coffee awaited us. We sat in large rattan chairs. We exchanged comments aimlessly on the evolution of world politics and on the relationship between science and civilization, while Laura Fermi and Mitzi Teller, sitting slightly apart, knitted placidly, as the women in old Europe often did when the men had to discuss serious things. I couldn't help picturing a third face among the shadows invading the corners of the room. Ida's. The meal, Teller's comments, had lifted my spirits. Maybe everything would work out for the best. Maybe Teller would implement the project he had outlined, and soon I would no longer be alone in my room with my memories, my bitterness, my painful impotence, overlooking the red earth of Los Alamos. Suddenly, there was a noise in the hall, and a large man with a strong build walked in. His face was flushed with anger. After being introduced to me, he exploded. His name was Wendell Radix. Of Yugoslav origin, he was rather well known in the scientific circles of the USA. Wendell had come straight from the house of the big boss, my homonym, Professor Robert Oppenheimer, whom he casually called Rob. Wendell threw himself onto a chair and burst out. I've had it. I've had it. There is really nothing that can be done about Rob. The cadmium, he just can't let it go, and cadmium is a catastrophe. If we go on like this, in 10 years we'll be the last place atomic power on Earth. I couldn't believe my ears. Before I could recover from my surprise, Fermi chimed in. I told Teller the same thing yesterday. It's as if he wants to build a bomb that doesn't explode and a reactor that explodes only to destroy our facilities. Right away, a fever took hold of the air, and the conversation lost its general tone. The problems that had motivated my being brought to the atomic capital of the United States were finally addressed. Angry, violent retorts crossed paths. It was as if I was finally beginning to penetrate a secret unknown to the world, of finding tied together the threads of a story that the defeat of Germany had shredded apart. The atomic adventure which ended for me when I was confined in a prisoner of war camp came alive once more. The bombs we made and hid in the caves at Innsbruck never did reach the submarines in Peur. Yet Adolf Hitler's insane dream had come true. Japan had received our uranium bombs, just not as the Führer had imagined it. It wasn't the Kriegsmarine submarines that carried Germany's atomic bombs to the land of the rising sun, but American airplanes which dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. There was no doubt about it. In the presence of Arthur Smith, impassive as ever, Teller, Fermi, and Wendell Radix openly discussed this story as if I were an insider. I'm glad you're here, said Wendell Radix, finally turning to me. I know about your work with zirconium. It is what has split Los Alamos in two. He explained the dispute that in the spring of 1946 divided the atomic scientists who had worked on the war effort. Despite the horrific but real results obtained by America's atomic bombings on Japan, certain scientists did not want to build more uranium bombs like the ones made by German technicians in Innsbruck and Hamburg. At the forefront of these scientists was Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer was about to complete his work when American intelligence agents discovered our atomic gadgets. The greatest of men have their pettinesses. As a scientist, Robert Oppenheimer could not accept that other scientists had resolved the same problem posed to all of them more quickly than he had. Anti-Hitlerian, he was profoundly sickened that the discovery was made by German scientists working for National Socialism. That is why, denying the evidence, he stood by his primitive project. Rob is stubborn like a child, said Wendell Radix. He won't copy your system. He argues that we can still make an explosive that is far superior to the one you produced. Therefore, it's not absolutely necessary for you to work in our laboratories. While Soviet technicians listen religiously to your former colleagues who were arrested by the Russians, most German atomic scientists, whom we rounded up in spite of Oppenheimer's orders, remain in prisoner of war camps. Without being aware, I was my homonym's #1 adversary. The bomb he designed differed from ours only in its use of cadmium instead of zirconium. The bombs that exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, held separators made from zirconium, designed to shield the subcritical uranium masses from one another. The military high command declared this device perfect. They simply requested that efforts be made to try to improve it while maintaining the principle. Robert Oppenheimer went further. 13 days after Nagasaki, on August 22nd, 1945 to be exact, which is to say, 3 weeks behind schedule, the first American atomic experiment was carried out with American-made bombs in the Alamogordo Desert. These bombs contained protective shields made from cadmium. The results were dismal. Still, Oppenheimer would not admit his mistake. In spite of all the indications from Teller, Radix, and Fermi, he continued to argue that the failure was not due to the replacement of zirconium with cadmium. In his opinion, the failure was due to a mistiming of the explosion. He said it detonated before the scheduled time. When the 4 atomic masses came together, a significant amount of uranium had already been dispersed into the atmosphere. "You see the grotesqueness of this situation," said Radix, literally boiling. "The thunder we brought on Hiroshima terrified the world. We were looked upon as new gods, possessors of an unbelievable power. But in reality, we didn't possess the secrets to this power. Worse, we refused to discover and exploit them." "But the Russians must know about all this?" I asked. "Everything allows us to assume so." It was Arthur Smith who talked for the first time. He had a tiny, wispy voice, and spoke with his eyes pointed up to the sky, his hands locked around one of his knees. "Yes, everything allows us to assume so," he repeated, "and to dread it. The policy pursued by President Roosevelt was such that today our country is teeming with Soviet observers. 3 of your colleagues who remained in Innsbruck's secret factory until the surrender of Germany have disappeared. There's a 99% chance that they were kidnapped by the Russians. It is perfectly possible, then, that Stalin knows the truth about the atomic bombs in Japan, and about our failure at Alamogordo." "Of course they know," said Edward Teller. "Burns himself told me about it. At the last conference of Ministers of Foreign Affairs in Moscow, while pushing to have a discussion on the issue of international control of atomic energy, Molotov leaned in close and said with a wry smile, 'You wouldn't by any chance happen to have a bomb in your pocket? We could use a lighter.' A few moments later, when Burns offered him a light, Molotov continued, 'My, you don't have an atomic lighter. So the Germans didn't invent them?' We could not have been more elegantly mocked." "That will continue for a time," said Enrico Fermi. "The other day I got into a rather stormy discussion, my goodness. You know Rob. He hardly ever gets upset. But this time he couldn't keep his cool. I was rather upset as well, and at one point I uttered the words madness and even unconscious treason. Suddenly, he turned completely pale. He cut me off with his dry voice, which becomes a little nasally when he wants to be unpleasant. 'It's you who speaks of treason, Fermi,' he said. 'Treason of the cause of democracy, no doubt, but I was told that in 1935 you wanted to name your transuranium element Mussolinium.'" "Is that true?" I asked. "It's true," acknowledged Fermi. "Yes, but that is just schoolgirl politics," declared Arthur Smith as he joined our discussion for the second time. "Do you really believe that the Russians asked Hertz whether he hung a portrait of Hitler in his room, or if he hums the Horst Wessel lied while he shaves in the morning? These are trivialities unworthy of intelligent people." "Exactly," replied Wendell Radix. "I completely agree with you. We gave the Germans a good race in atomic military hardware. We almost lost it. But today, the world is different. The war with Germany is over, and the only rival of our stature is Russia. Whether we like it or not, whoever masters the atom today will master the world of tomorrow. It is criminal, therefore, to not use all of the forces at our disposal to accomplish this goal. Rob's sensibility puts me in a state of indescribable rage." Arthur Smith stood up and took a few steps across the room. "It is likely to get even worse as I announce to you the arrival of Klaus Fuchs in Los Alamos. You knew him," he said as he turned to me. "Yes," I replied. "We worked together at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin." "You were good comrades." "No. In truth, we didn't share the same interests outside of work. If I remember correctly, he was the son of an Israelite school teacher from Prussia. He was a curious fellow, very timid, yet he had these strange, aggressive outbursts. But he wasn't mean. I remember that every time he said something harsh, he would immediately apologize and show remorse for what he had done." "When did you last see him?" "In 1932, I think. He was forced to leave Germany a few months before Hitler took power. I was told that he went to England. I had no idea that he had settled in your homeland." "No," Teller said in his gentle voice. "He hasn't settled in the United States. He is an English citizen and worked with us during the war. He visits us from time to time to do short internships." "That's what makes Rob's shortcomings so much worse," continued Radix. "The persecution that the Jews suffered in Germany impacted him profoundly. The hatred he feels causes him to lose all measure. I wouldn't be surprised if deep in his heart he hoped for Soviet world domination, so long as that domination resulted in the crushing of Germany for 1,000 years." "Passion in politics is a very nefarious thing," sighed Teller just before placing his hand on my shoulder. "My dear Erwin, you have no idea what difficulties I had to overcome so that you could work with us. I had to vouch for you, to commit my honor and Mitzi's. Grant me the grace. If tomorrow you feel some hostility around you, believe me that there are many among us who do not hold the German people collectively responsible for the crimes committed by some Hitlerians. All of our sympathy, all of our esteem, is with you. My hope is that your comrades can soon join us, so that together we can stop Robert Oppenheimer from realizing his vision, which is to return Los Alamos to the Indians." "How?" I shouted. "But that isn't possible." "It is simply true. Robert Oppenheimer is not far from believing that world peace has definitively been assured, that not only is it unnecessary to manufacture more uranium bombs, but that it is completely useless to work on the hydrogen bomb, and that atomic innovation should only be used to modernize industry. I would agree if the Russians thought as he did. I have every reason to believe that that is not the case." I did not sleep well that night. The conversation haunted me. So American atomic power was an illusion. On the contrary, it was the Russians who seemed to possess a certain advantage in this field. Those who knew them a little could assume that the rivalries and quarrels that divided atomic scientists in the New World did not trouble the Soviet laboratories. Accustomed to copying foreign prototypes, they had most certainly reproduced our Innsbruck bombs faithfully. Neither was it a mystery that they had reactivated our Peenemünde factory for remote-controlled devices. The uranium mines in East Germany and those in Czechoslovakia belonged to them. This was all rather serious. Of course, as far as the public was concerned, we were preparing new tests which were to take place in Bikini. But if I had correctly understood that night's discussion, these experiments were not being announced under the happiest of auspices.